So let me welcome you, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. My name is Silvano Zapoli Caiani, and together with Luca Oliva and Caterina Del Sordo, I'm one of the organizers of this online seminar, Reconstructing Carnap. The aim of the seminar is to explore the philosophy of Rudolf Carnap, both in terms of its theoretical coherence and its historical development and critical reception as well. We hope to provide a space for fruitful dialogue that brings together diverse perspectives on Carnap's thought, from foundational roots to ongoing relevance today. Let me remind you that a seminar is being recorded and that the recordings will soon be available on YouTube on the Reconstructing Carnap webinar series channel. Today marks the 6th session of this 2025 series, and we are very, very pleased to welcome our speaker, Professor Thomas Uebel. Let me spend a few words to introduce you, Professor Uebel. Professor Uebel is a emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Manchester, UK. He has held a teaching and research position at several prestigious institutions, including Northwestern University, the University of Pittsburgh, the Technical University of Berlin, the University of Vienna, and the London School of Economics. And he's also past president of the International Society for the History and the Philosophy of Science. Uebel research focuses on logical empiricism, many, and the Vienna Circle, and the works of Otto Neurath in particular. His publications include, among the others, books Overcoming Logical Positivism from Within and Otto Neurath, Philosophy Between Science and Politics. Uebel has also co-edited significant volumes such as Otto Neurath's economic writings and the Routledge Handbook of Logical Empiricism. I remember the audience that the meeting is being recorded and that we have 2 hours, 1 hour for the presentation and 1 hour for the discussion, divided by a short break of 5 minutes. So please, Thomas, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Silvano, for this kind introduction. And yeah, well, let's start right away and have the first slide, please. We'll do this as some of the audience may know. We've arranged it such since my machine somehow doesn't like whatever. So thankfully, Katarina has the slides and she'll move them on as needed. Okay, so introduction. What follows is, as is quite common, a presentation of preliminary research results. What makes this my presentation here even more provisional than usual is the nature of the topics that are treated, namely confusing comments by an author about his own work, and namely by an author who is generally known for his meticulousness. Carnap's retrospective comments in his philosophical autobiography have long puzzled scholars of the revisionist persuasion, i.e., scholars who have battled long and hard and largely successfully against the caricature of logical positivists as phenomenalist, reductionist, and foundationalists. They are puzzled by Carnap's remarks because he seems to contradict them with regard to the prize exhibit of their revisionist campaign, namely the interpretation of his Der logische Aufbau der Welt. Next slide, please. Here's the relevant quote, too long quote. You probably know it, but I'll just go it. According to the original conception, Carnap writes, original conception of the Vienna Circle, he thinks a system of knowledge, although growing constantly more comprehensive, was regarded as a closed system in the following sense. We assumed that there was a certain rock bottom of knowledge, the knowledge of the immediate given, which was indubitable. Every other kind of knowledge was supposed to be firmly supported by this basis and therefore likewise decidable with certainty. This was the picture I had given in the logische Aufbau. It was supported by the influence of Mach's doctrine of the sensations as the elements of knowledge, by Russell's logical atomism, and finally by Wittgenstein's thesis that all propositions are truth functions of the elementary propositions. This conception led to Wittgenstein's principle verifiability, which says that it is in principle possible to obtain either the definite verification or a definite refutation for any meaningful sentence. Next slide, please. Looking back at this view from our present position, I must admit it was difficult to reconcile with certain other conceptions which we had at the time, especially the methodology of science. It was clear that the laws of physics could not possibly be completely verified. This conclusion led Schlick, under the influence of Wittgenstein, to the view that physical laws should no longer be regarded as general sentences, but rather as rules for the derivation of singular sentences. Others, however, began to doubt the adequacy of the principle of verifiability. Neurath had always rejected the alleged rock bottom of knowledge. Thus, some of us, especially Neurath, Hahn, and I, came to the conclusion that we had to look for a more liberal criterion of significance and verifiability. This group was sometimes called the left wing of the circle, in contrast to the more conservative right wing, chiefly represented by Schlick and Weismann, who remained in personal contact with Wittgenstein and were inclined to maintain his views and formulations. And this is from pages 57, 58, and note that there's also a passage on page 50 where he especially says the very same thing specifically about the Aufbau again. So this is, so to speak, if you like, a repeat offense. Next slide, please. Now, here, from what Carnap told us here, I think there's numerous points which we can query. It needs to be read really closely. First, concerning the Aufbau, with Michael Friedman, we can query its description as phenomenalist, foundationalist. With Richard Creath, we can query its description as strict verificationalist. Also concerning Wittgenstein, here we can query Carnap's reading of the Tractatus and its apparent association with strict verificationism. I'll come back to both, but there's also the narrative frame that Carnap here puts in. Whose original concept is Carnap relating here? Next slide, please. Note that the introduction of the sentence section just quoted from, called Liberalization of Empiricism, begins with the simplicity and coherence of the system as knowledge, as most of us in the Vienna Circle conceived it, gave it a certain appeal and strength in the face of criticisms. On the other hand, these features caused a certain rigidity, etc., etc. Now, the suggestion here seems to be that the original conception was one shared by most, but not all, of the members of the Vienna Circle. This highlights, I take it, the later brief remark that Neurath always rejected the alleged rock bottom of knowledge, and so suggests his long-standing opposition to the foundationalism supposedly originally endorsed by his circle colleagues. But did everybody else share the original conception? Carnap gave no indication otherwise. Next slide, please. So it seems we may take Carnap to claim that the Aufbau, as understood by him, elaborated the epistemological presumptions shared with most circle members. Thus his talk of textbook empiricist foundationalism encompassing methodological solipsism as starting point and certainty as the mark of knowledge. It is this claim, of course, that's controversial in light of what we've all learned from the readings of Aufbau that both Rick Creath and Michael Friedman pioneered. So the supposed benchmark of certainty, note, for example, that in the book itself, and this is what Creath and Friedman always stress, rightly so, that the supposed benchmark of certainty of knowledge is nowhere mentioned in it, nor even is the notion of justification used, even the term used in the book. Stretching it just a little bit, one could even say that the Aufbau didn't do epistemology at all, but only developed a constitution theory, a hierarchical theory of concepts defining each purely structurally by its place in the overall system, and thereby providing a ground for objectivity in the pronouncements of science, the ineliminable and indeed indispensable subjectivity of his investigators notwithstanding. This, of course, is a totally different picture from that which Carnap just gave us in his autobiography. So, knowing of both, one might really wonder whether Carnap wasn't somewhat confused when he wrote his autobiography. But not only the remarks about the Aufbau are odd, but also those about Proposition 5 of the Tractatus, which is obviously at issue here, namely, propositions are truth functions of elementary propositions. It requires a pretty controversial reading of it to be able to claim that it, quote, led to Wittgenstein's principle of verifiability. Even more so when the principle was defined as follows, namely as demanding strict verifiability. Arguably, the Tractatus, as you know, did not have a verificationist theory of meaning, but a truth conditional one, 406, 441. Wittgenstein himself appears to have embraced strict verificationism only in 1929, and then communicated it to Schlick and Weismann on the 22nd of December, thanks to, as we know, for the notes by Weismann, which Brian McGillis has preserved. And then Wittgenstein's following view on hypothesis was communicated on the following March. So in sum, Carnap's discussion of Wittgensteinian matters seems out of kilter too. Next slide, please. Note what appears to have happened in Carnap's treatment of Wittgensteinian matters. The different developmental stages were collapsed into one, with the later ones falsely representing the earlier ones too. We should make a note of this and ask, may this be a significant pattern? Now, Carnap also failed to mention in his autobiography that when he and his fellow left-wingers decided to reject strict verificationism, they did not embark on a totally new kind of theorizing at all, but in broad principle, though not in detail, they reverted to a non-strict verificationism he, Carnap, had already pioneered in Scheinprobleme of 1928. All that he said here in the autobiography is that although we abandoned the principle of verifiability, we did not yet see clearly what criterion of significance should take its place. But I recognized at least the general direction in which we had to move. Well, given Carnap's standards of clarity, I suppose he's right, but he did have a blueprint for non-strict verificationism already. So what we find, excuse me, is just like the structuralism of the Aufbau, the confirmationalism of Scheinprobleme was simply disappeared in autobiography. Next slide, please. So confronted with these incongruities about the Aufbau, Michael Friedman argued that Carnap did not report, quote, his own motivations when writing the Aufbau, but rather the way in which the Aufbau was initially understood within the Vienna Circle. Given the narrative frame, this is, well, a bit odd, but it's not at all implausible, especially if we add that, and I quote from Michael again, the Circle understood Tractatus as articulating a foundationalist empiricist conception of meaning, and read Aufbau as the precise realization of just such a Tractarian theory of meaning. And this is, I think, an absolutely correct report on how the Circle at the time, around about 1930, thought of a Tractatus and of perhaps even of the Aufbau as well. So accordingly, reading Carnap as misrepresenting himself would be a mistake. Instead, Friedman suggested a largely straight developmental line on Carnap's part from the structuralist Aufbau past über protocol sentence and then beyond into a logical syntax. Next slide, please. Now, I must confess here that for better or worse in my own studies on the protocol sentence debate, while I happily agreed with all the revisionist analyses of Aufbau, I remained impressed by this following passage in Old and New Logic of 1930, where Carnap says the positivist and materialist constitution systems do not contradict one another, both are correct and indispensable. The positivist system corresponds to the epistemic viewpoint because it proves the validity of knowledge by reduction to the given. Well, so I tended to think of Carnap's autobiographical report as reporting also how he himself had come to view the Aufbau around 1930. He himself had come to understand his own book in the foundationalist fashion of the circle's reading of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, which, by the way, was not discouraged by Wittgenstein either, namely as empiricist epistemology. And accordingly, I also then took Carnap's remarks, a long passage in the beginning, which we read, to suggest that he himself joined Schlick and everybody else in adopting Wittgenstein's strict verificationism and the laws as rules conception. Next slides, please. So what we get is two Carnaps. One Carnap was never wavering in his rational reconstructor's commitment to merely reporting what the seemingly universally shared view of the epistemic order of the objects of cognition commits us to, and held his head high above the positivist fray around him, while the other Carnap actually capitulated precisely to this positivist fray around him. How could we decide between them? With the text before us so far, which seem to accommodate sort of both readings, or not contradicting design, I propose to park the contested reading of the Aufbau for the moment and asked first, by way of preliminaries, what published evidence is there that Carnap himself actually fell in with Wittgenstein's strict verificationism? Because that is the assumption I just said I've made, well, in light of that. Now, for the longest time, I didn't know of any published evidence for that, but working with Richard Creath and Richard Zach on volume 4 of Carnap's collected works, I came across translations of summaries of lectures that Carnap gave in Warsaw on the 27th, 29th of November and on the 1st of December 1930, which were only ever published in Polish in the journal Ruch Filozoficzny. And these turned out to be, or rather one of them, the second of these, turned out to be, for me at least, it seemed, the tip of a proverbial iceberg. Next slide, please. The tip-off is in the summary of the first lecture outing of Die Überwindung der Metaphysik durch logische Analyse der Sprache, this famous paper of 1932, which he there gave for the first time in public on the 29th of November, 1930 at the Warsaw Philosophical Society. The second paragraph of the summary reads, "A sentence can become nonsense if it contains a word without meaning. A word has a meaning if and only if the truth conditions for using the word are established. It must be possible to formulate these truth conditions either using different words, definition of a derived word, or they must at least be known to the person using the word, postulation of a basic word. Every definition must finally lead to basic words. These basic words must refer to the immediately given, the experienced contents. If the conditions mentioned are satisfied for a word, then every sentence can be translated into a sentence about the given, thus is verifiable, and thus has sense." The clue, I think, here lies, that I talked about, lies in what's said here and what's not said in the published version. This is the claim: the basic words must refer only to the immediate given, and that every sentence can be translated into a sentence about the given. Just those bits were dropped from the published version. Next slide, please. Note that if every meaningful sentence can be translated into a sentence about the given, then universal sentences cannot count as properly meaningful. This strongly suggests that strict verification has been adopted. Now, I take this suggestion to hold unless contradicted by other evidence. Now, since strict verification does not follow from the widely shared presumption of the epistemic order of objects of cognition alone, I also take it to be an indication that that Carnap here adopted a more committed epistemological point of view, very much like he reported in Autobiography. But why should he do it? Did Carnap in 1930, because just after Weismann reported Wittgenstein's revelations about strict verificationism and hypotheses or rules. Did Carnap just fall for Wittgenstein's views just like that? Let's look at some other historical remarks. Next slide, please. Consider, for instance, how Carnap reported on these matters in logical syntax and testability and meaning. By then conceiving of the physical language unreservedly as one with unrestricted quantification, Carnap wrote, "On the view here expounded, the domain of the scientific sentences is not so restricted as on the one formerly held by the Vienna Circle. It was originally maintained that every sentence, in order to be significant, must be completely verifiable," in reference to Tractatus, to Weismann and Schlick. Every sentence, therefore, must be a molecular sentence formed of concrete sentences, so-called elementary sentences. And here reference again to Wittgenstein, and he refers to it by pages. From what I can make out, these are propositions 5 and propositions 5.3, and at this point he refers back to his own Aufbau. On this view, there was no place for the laws of nature amongst the sentences of the language. Either these laws had to be deprived of their unrestricted universality and be interpreted merely as report sentences, or they were left with their unrestricted universality and regarded not as proper sentences of the object language, but merely as directions for the construction of sentences. Ramsey, Schlick, again with references to Wittgenstein, and hence as a kind of syntactic rules. Next slide, please. The basic story is here the same as in Autobiography, but with considerable more detail, and indeed, numerous points again require critical discussion. They concern the terms "the one," what the Vienna Circle thought originally, and of course the claims about Tractatus and the Aufbau. Note, though, first that if these remarks, and more or less very similar ones, are made in testability, are to be believed as they stand, then not only was Carnap a strict verificationist, or then Carnap was a strict verificationist already in and since the Aufbau, perhaps for 2 years before Wittgenstein revealed his own adoption of it to Schlick and Weismann. Now, there are reasons to be skeptical on both counts. Next slide, please. According to these remarks, up to the early 30s, Carnap would have conceived of the language of science as a, quote, molecular language, a language limited to molecular sentences, sentences without unrestricted quantification, that thereby fulfills, quote, the requirement of confirmability and testability in its most radical form. But did the Aufbau only allow for molecular sentences? This view was challenged by Richard Creath, for whom the balance of evidence weighs against Carnap to have been a strict verificationist in the Aufbau. He showed that the Aufbau contains only one clearly verificationist passage, namely in paragraph 180, which, however, is contradicted elsewhere and remains unsupported by other passages in the book. Therefore, Richard Creath concluded that Carnap does not commit himself to the additional assumptions that would make strict verificationism intrinsic to constructionalism. Next slide. Note that what we obviously hear, what Rick here has put a finger on, is clearly a certain instability in the Aufbau. On the one hand, he says that. On the other hand, he says that. And it seems to me that this instability of the Aufbau comes in rather handy if one wants to have, or if one simply has, selective memory about its contents. Given the inconsistency between the strict verificationism in paragraph 180 and the unproblematical rendition of universal quantification for propositional functions in paragraph 97, and the fact that the former stems from part of the book likely to have been written after his participation in the Circle's discussions of the Tractatus, it would not be surprising if the Aufbau that Carnap remembered and further thought about were the one in which paragraph 180 dominated and 197 was forgotten or silently corrected. In other words, given the circumstances, it may not be surprising that, or it wouldn't be surprising, that after he heard from Weismann about Wittgenstein's new views, he noticed their fit with paragraph 180 of Aufbau, which then stabilized his memory. Next slide, please. Now, concerning the Tractatus, on account of propositions 5 and 5.3, Carnap ascribed to it the position of, again, the position of strict verificationism, which demands that every sentence, quote, be a molecular sentence formed of concrete sentences, the so-called elementary sentences. Now, in testability, Carnap also cited, in addition to those two, propositions 5.521. Now, 5.521 of the Tractatus is indeed extremely difficult to interpret. It seems to oppose the view of universal quantification as a logical product of the values of the function quantified over, but whether this reading is correct has long remained controversial, and there are some good readings of it that show that actually it doesn't contradict it. It has a far more highly specific sort of aim, but that's another thing. Nevertheless, Carnap seems to have based his Tractatus interpretation on 5.521, just so controversially interpreted, for he writes, here truth functions are conceived as not including general operators. Next slide. However, so that's what Carnap says. However, and there's a hiccup here. In Facts and Propositions, a paper which is listed in the manifesto of the Circle, in the bibliography of the manifesto of the Circle, which Carnap put together. There, Ramsey stated, about these general propositions, I adopt the view of Mr. Wittgenstein that for all x, fx is to be regarded as equivalent to the logical product of all the values of fx, i.e. the combination of fx1 and fx2 and fx3 and etc. And that there is an x such that fx is similarly their logical sum. Now here I'm puzzled. With no contrary sources to call upon, I think it requires an explanation why Carnap did not consider Ramsey's report authoritative when he read it. But perhaps this suggests again that Carnap's claims in logical syntax and testability record, like the views in the autobiography, record views he held around 1930, views he arrived at to integrate what Weismann reported about Wittgenstein's most recent revelations and integrate that with the Aufbau and the Tractatus he knew, like focusing on paragraph 180 of Aufbau, focusing on proposition 5.521 of Tractatus, established in retrospect a continuity on what kind of verification was put forward in those earlier views with views which he held at this later stage in 1930, but which is a continuity that we nowadays can see did not obtain. Next slide, please. Setting aside then for the moment that the date that claims that date strict verificationism to the Tractatus and Aufbau, let's briefly look at Carnap's phrasing of some other claims. Was strict verification the view, the only view held by the Vienna Circle, by all of its members before Carnap saw the light in 1931? That's when he gave up strict verificationism again. The original German is a bit more precise, calling this view üblich, common, allows exceptions, and dating it to früher, earlier, is unspecific about what precise period was meant, and it certainly doesn't mean originally or in the beginning. So Carnap's original here in logical syntax is less dogmatic and misleading on the development issue. It allows, but by no means suggests, that the strict verificationism was more limited, both in terms of supporters and precisely when its adoption took place. Next slide, please. Still, it seems fair to say that Carnap's reading of Aufbau and Tractatus suggests a fair bit of autobiographical curve smoothing. Thus, his epistemologization of the Aufbau and his neglect of Scheinprobleme. But is this already the whole story? Simply a bit of curve smoothing? Note that if these retrospective tests, that these retrospective tests pushes strict verificationism all the way back to 1928, and make no reference to Wittgenstein's cataclysmic revelations of late 29 and early 30. So what about the period 28 to 1930, post-Scheinprobleme, say? Was Carnap really a strict verificationist too, as his retrospective remarks seem to claim? When, in other words, did Carnap's commitment to molecularism really begin, and what form did it take? Next slide, please. In logical syntax, we saw Carnap lay out the options given molecularism. Either these laws had to be deprived of their unrestricted universality and be interpreted merely as report sentences, or they were left their unrestricted universality and regarded not as proper sentences of the object language, but merely as direction for the construction of sentences. Here, no indication was given which option he had chosen, only that Wittgenstein, Schlick, and Ramsey had chosen the latter. In Autobiography, you may recall, Carnap did not mention the laws as reports option at all, but only mentioned the laws as rules options, ascribed it to Schlick under the influence of Wittgenstein, and made it sound as if initially the whole circle agreed with us for dissent on the matter, later led to the split into two wings. Next slide. Now consider testability in meaning. Carnap writes, previously influenced also by Mach and Russell, I too accepted a molecular language, reference to Aufbau. According to the positivist principle of testability in most radical form, I restricted atomic sentences to sentences about actual experiences. The laws of physics, as well as the predictions, were interpreted as records of present and remembered past experience, namely those experiences from which the law of the prediction or the prediction is usually from which law is said to be inferred by induction. Thus, I followed the first of the two ways mentioned above. Physical laws were also interpreted as molecular sentences. So that's what he says there, and the two ways we've already noted. Next slide, please. Note then that here in testability, Carnap specified a non-Wittgensteinian way of ensuring molecularism. It amounted to either restricting universal sentences or disposing of them and only forming conjunctions of singular sentences. Do we have an inconsistency here? According to Autobiography, he adopted the laws as rules view. According to testability, he adopted the laws as report strategy. As we saw, logical syntax didn't say anything about it. But I think no inconsistency obtains if, that is, we make two suitable allowances or interpretive assumptions. Next slide, please. The first allowance or assumption is that Carnap switched strategies once he heard of Wittgenstein's new ideas in 1930, and that this later strategy is what Autobiography specifies. The second allowance or assumption is that Carnap confused the Aufbau position, for whatever reason, with one dominant, at least for some time during the 2 years following the Aufbau, and therefore spoke of the post-Aufbau pre-1930 position as the Aufbau position. And that's what testability specifies. Now, this helps, you may agree, this would help to systematize Carnap's recollections. But where can we find any evidence for this? Next slide, please. For this, we must turn to a particularly difficult chapter of Carnap's career, one that, interestingly, he has virtually neglected in Autobiography, and which we find only traces in posthumous publications, namely his Untersuchungen zur allgemeinen Axiomatik. As you know, Steve Audie and Andrei Karos showed the importance of this word as background and motivation for ultimately Gödel's proof, and also as a preliminary form, albeit abandoned in 1930, of the meta-logic that Carnap was to develop in logical syntax. What I want to do now is build further on work on Untersuchungen that has been done by Georg Schiemer, who found that Carnap, like Tarski, but independently of him, developed broadly model-theoretic kinds of conceptions, which, given the standard history of logic of the two contrasting traditions, he should not have been able to do, because the two founding traditions were said to converge only later. Next slide, please. Those two traditions are, ever so briefly, the algebraic one, which conceives of logic primarily as dealing with uninterpreted first-order languages and thought of logic as a calculus to be applied variously and at will. And the other one being the type-theoretic tradition associated with Frege and Russell, which conceived of logic as dealing with second-order interpreted languages and thought of logic as a universal language. Now, the point at issue for us here is that if logic provides a universal framework for formalizing discourse, then it cannot be transcended, and so it can't really sustain an object meta-language distinction that would permit the interpretation of its formalisms to be varied. Now, with Carnap as a member of the type-theoretic tradition, we would expect him to be so limited. For instance, given universal quantification, we'd expect him to be stuck with its unrestricted application, because no domains could be specified in a meta-language as in the algebraic tradition. Yet what we find in Untersuchung, or rather what Schema has found in Untersuchungen and in Abriss, his logic book of 1929, is that Carnap found precisely the means to do so. Next slide, please. Untersuchungen set out to provide a formal theory of theory axiomatizations. First, a Grunddisziplin, a basic discipline, was set out, providing the basic logico-mathematical tools, and then in a second step, the outlines of a general theory of axiomatization were given, and issues like completeness and categoricity were discussed, and then we get into the famous and notorious Gabelbarkeitssatz, etc., with this not at issue here. As Carnap had pointed out in Eigentliche und Uneigentliche Begriffe of 1927, echoing Frege's debate with Hilbert, axiomatized theories do not have a concrete interpretation without further specification. Implicitly defined terms apply to whatever fits the network of axioms that fit their meaning. Now, formalizing interpretations, as Carnap understood it, requires that definite reference relations are to be specified, and indeed specified by purely logical means. But now comes the question, how can a logical universalist logician like Carnap determine which specific type of object an axiomatic theory applies to? Next slide. Here is the fact, namely that, as I already mentioned, in axiomatics, as Schema showed us, Carnap showed how a logical universalist can do so, namely he can restrict the domain of quantification. To this end, Carnap developed techniques of domain variability. Instead of specifying the intended model by specifying in a meta-language the domain of object language quantifiers, domain variation does so from inside, as it were, by simulating model variation. My interpretive proposal is this, that given that domain variability amounts to quantifier restriction, the strategy meant in testability is exemplified. Using the tools of axiomatics, Carnap was able to deal with laws as demanded by molecularism. With domain variability, he was able to restrict universal sentences. And can we skip the next 2 pages? We could come back. Yeah, skip this one too, please. Thank you, that's great. And we could come back to that because really the idea is and we could for the details of the domain. So the method of domain variation, or alternative ones, devised in axiomatic, Schema found quite a few of them, allowed Carnap to tame universal quantification and make it safe for strict verification in principle, because it's restricted to just a domain, and if the domain is finite, well, with any luck, we can verify it strictly. Note also that this availability of domain variability helps to make intelligible how Carnap could have come up with the retrospective accounts he did. With these techniques, after all, Carnap was able to sustain strict verificationism without as yet having adopted Wittgenstein's later position of laws as rules. For the strategies of domain variation and of interpreting laws as rules are functionally equivalent in rendering universal quantification compatible with molecularism. Next slide, please. Note even that Carnap's curve smoothing, if that's what it is, reaches even further. Once Carnap hit upon the techniques of domain variation, at least in retrospect, the Aufbau's endorsement of universal quantification in paragraph 97 need no longer contrast with its endorsement of strict verificationism in 180. For universal quantification reinterpreted would no longer be unrestricted, and then 97 and 180 are quite happily compatible. So given the techniques he developed in axiomatics, Carnap's views on verificationism appear more broadly continuous enough to have allowed his memory to collapse the strategies employed at either end of the development from 1928 to 1930 to the latter in his autobiography. Next slide. So far, so good. And yeah, and yeah, there's now it gets tricky, because it seems that Carnap did not remain happy with this solution for too long. He seems to have felt that the logico-structural demands of his Tractarian molecularism should impose still stricter restrictions on his systematization of axiomatized theories. Note that just as domain variation simulates model variation, so it only simulates molecularism, for unless they are regimented by domain predicates or functionally similar devices, universally quantified sentences break the limitation that molecularism imposes, yet, given the overall parameters of axiomatics, they remain legitimate. So in other words, the axiomatics is too liberal for strict molecularism. Next slide. And so at this point, we touch on what George Schiemer's presentation to this seminar here 6 weeks ago touched on, with a well-deserved, very big health warning. Carnap's shorthand notes of March 29, Neue Grundlegung der Logik. There is one discussion of it in the literature which states, it's a very good discussion indeed, which states its main idea is to erect a Hilbertian axiomatic superstructure on a Wittgensteinian basis. That's André Carros in his big book of 2007. Somehow, what Carnap tried to do there is shoehorn unrestricted universal quantification a la infinite conjunctions into a Tractarian framework to make them truth functions of atomic sentences. If your hair stands on edge, it's not only yours. Quantifiers were no longer provided by the Grunddisziplin of axiomatics, but they were to be envisaged, as they had been originally in axiomatics, but now in Neue Grundlegung, they were envisaged, or seemed to be envisaged, to be introduced via Hilbert's epsilon calculus for instrumentally interpreted axiomatizations. It's extremely dark. So given the sketchiness of Carnap's note, it's hard to disagree with Carros's verdict of the inconclusiveness and ultimate unworkability of Carnap's attempt to extend a truth-functional, finitary, molecular language to something usable for mathematics and science. So let's move on and have another slide, please. What do we move on to? We move on now to another of the lectures Carnap gave in previous. Thank you. In Warsaw in 1930, the third one, which has a title, "The Tautological Character of Inference." Carnap there pursued a project which seems to be, again, and this is the ice on which I'm moving, extremely thin, but if you have a look at the notes, well, what's the difference? The new method he uses here, as he seems to be envisaging in this lecture, of dealing with seemingly unrestricted quantification, was, well, it was a new method, and namely he darkly suggested a reinterpretation of such summits. So let's show you how dark matters get. The summary of that lecture, which was published in Ruch Physiolonowiczny, reads: thesis: all inference is tautological. The conclusion expresses nothing more than the premises do. Preliminary thesis: Every sentence is a truth function of atomic sentences. The material premises on which science rests we call atomic sentences. The formal premises, rules of inference, a priori inferences, etc., which are applied in the scientific process, we think of as collected in the system are. And then, after a little bit, he comes towards the end. Consequences of this thesis for epistemology. The different schools of epistemology agree that all valid knowledge must be derived from knowledge of the given. Since derivation is tautological, all scientific sentences can be translated back into sentences about the given. That's the methodological method of positivism. Next slide, please. All this, I find this extremely puzzling. But the bottom line seems to be, of the picture that Carnap gives us here, all we have in science by way of fully meaningful statements are singular statements which are truth functions of atomic sentences. All other statements, the axioms, the formal or material inference rules and statements of these rules that are mentioned, and importantly, universally quantified statements, are collected in this system are. And they are, and now he seems to follow the model of the Tractatus with its notorious elucidations, they are viewed as uneigentliche or improper statements that are valued only for what they do for us, but not what they say in themselves. Carnap's lecture notes indicate that that inductive reasoning indeed is radically reinterpreted. Thus, we read there, from the course of perception, the physicist infers, but with a probability coefficient. Bits and bits. Thesis, S does not say more than U, and U is a disjunction of all the atomic sentences compatible with S, and S is a statement derivable from state descriptions. So, and okay, S, blah, 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 and now comes the sentences. The perceptual process is one of those from which, given the rules of physics, follows the so-and-so solar eclipse. All his examples he gives there were eclipse tomorrow, eclipse in 2 years, etc. So he has a prediction concerning an eclipse that is gained from a set of singular sentences of perceptual experiences. How does he get there? He does not say. I believe that's where the system R comes in, the uneigentliche Sätze of rules and whatever. Next slide, please. Much remains dark, yet this seems clear as far as it goes. Universal statements like the generalizations of physics were radically reinterpreted. They had their status as bona fide propositions revoked and became rules for transforming singular statements into other singular statements. What this means is that Carnap here employed a variant of Wittgenstein's conception of hypotheses by speaking of the rules of physics. This is now, if this is so, then here we in fact have direct evidence that Carnap adopted the rules of laws as rules strategy as he suggested he did in Autobiography, and as I suggested we can read out of the shorthand, out of the summary of this lecture two days earlier in Warsaw. Needless to say, Carnap's whole attempt of explaining away any increase in knowledge by induction was not more successful here in this in this system than it was in Neue Grundlegung, and he also abandoned it. We never hear again about from Carnap about any attempts to show that all reasoning is indeed tautologous, right? So next slide, please. Thank you. So what we have found, you can see towards a conclusion, relief is at hand. So we found examples of both of the strategies that Carnap's historical recollections claimed he had adopted in the course of trying to work out how scientific and other empirical knowledge is to be reconstructed, while under the, and here I quote André Caros, the tyranny of the requirement that all meaningful statements be truth functions of atomic sentences. I think that's captured rather nicely. What were the two strategies again? The Laws's report strategy which he remembered in testability, restricted universal sentences or a conjunction. We found developed in Untersuchung as the method of domain variation, and that was used from 28 to 29, perhaps even into 1930. And the other one, the Laws's rules strategy, which he remembered in Autobiography, we found adopted in his Warsaw lectures, namely with deduction with the rules of physics, and used from apparently mid-1930 until around the summer of 1931. Next slide, please. So Carnap's retrospective remarks are in those respects borne out. How does this result bear upon our concern? What was that? Well, what disturbed us originally was the attribution of foundationalism to the Aufbau. Paragraph 180, we will hold, is not representative. Okay. Having parked that concern, we did find Carnap not only endorsing Tractarian foundationalism in 1930, but having developed techniques to accommodate it, if required, already by 1928, namely techniques that allowed demands of strict verificationism to be met. So, was Carnap a foundationalist from 1928 onwards? Heaven forbid, even in the Aufbau? This is far from clear. To be sure, a highly idealized line of subservience to Tractarian dogma in a particularly restrictive interpretation could be drawn, as apparently by Carnap himself, from the Aufbau paragraph 180 through 1930 until 1931, when, I'd say partly in response to Neurath's physicalist agitation, Carnap reasserted the standard understanding of scientific generalizations and the standard use of hypotheses in Die physikalische Sprache, in the published version of Die physikalische Sprache als Universalsprache der Wissenschaft. When his now normal use of hypotheses was, of course, properly, as you know, properly misunderstood by Wittgenstein, who immediately went to claim that his view had been plagiarized by Carnap, when in fact by that time Carnap had given up the view which Wittgenstein thought he had plagiarized there. But hey, that's yet another matter. Another slide, please. But so that's one reconstruction. That's, as it were, the foundationalist. But another reconstruction is possible that I think takes better account of some of the bumps in the road that we've noticed. Noting, for instance, that strict verification precludes unrestricted quantification, we may note first that the relevant instability of the Aufbau, paragraphs 180 versus 197, and the utterly contrary non-strict verificationism of Scheinprobleme, that these things indicate that, in fact, Carnap's 1928 verificationism wasn't stable either. He either had it, he seems to have it both ways at different points. And then we may note, secondly, that in axiomatics, or in Untersuchungen, as I called it before, in Untersuchungen, this instability was, if you like it, itself institutionalized. How so? Well, what happened in Untersuchung is that there Carnap determined that quantifier that their quantifier restriction by domain variation was an option for him, but it was not obligatory. For characteristically, the Grunddisziplin, that was the basic part of the general theory of axiomatics, which sets out the logical mathematical tools for the theorizing, that Grunddisziplin remained explicitly and very proudly neutral between the two positions of what Carnap called constructivism and absolutism. Constructivism affirms finitism without rejecting the principle of excluded middle, and absolutism affirms unrestricted quantification. So there, this neutrality there sort of seems to go rather well with this sort of looking both ways on strict verificationism in the year before. So accordingly, a different interpretation of the path that Carnap took would say that until his capitulation to Wittgenstein's revelations in 1930, Carnap's texts, starting with a late edition of paragraph 180 of Aufbau and the contrary proposal of Scheinprobleme, show him to be not endorsing, but simply exploring the positions of strict and non-strict verification, of full-on molecularism and non-molecularism, and see what he could do on either way. He's, as it were, just trying it out, seeing where it leads him. Next slide, please. So finally, to our title question. Was Carnap totally confused when he remembered the Aufbau in the mid-1950s when he wrote Autobiography? Not at all. To be sure, he got most of Aufbau badly wrong. And on this point, the revisionist Vienna Circle scholars can remain very steadfast with Friedman and Creath. And certainly he lost by the 50s, he seems to have failed to remember some of the subtleties which still his mid-1930s accounts in testability and logical syntax possessed. But he was not totally wrong or totally confused. He did catch on, after all, to paragraph 180 of Aufbau, and how what he says in there, the strict verificationism that paragraph seems to endorse, how it connects with how he fell for Wittgenstein's combination of laws of rules and strict verificationism in 1930. Right? No, note that even if we do gainsay the 180 as just explorative, paragraph 180 of Aufbau is just explorative, with the latter, with his falling in line with what Wittgenstein's combination of laws as rule and strict verification, I think the diagnosis of foundationalism there is pretty much inescapable. Well, that's a fairly ecumenical conclusion, and insofar perhaps even a little bit boring. So here's another one, slightly provocative, maybe to consider, and that is the following. Namely, put it on the table, see what you make of it. That is that the talk of the Aufbau is problematic and perhaps the real root of the confusion. Accordingly, it was in the first place this confusion that Carnap fell victim to. And I must add, as much as I did in posing the question as I did in saying the Aufbau. Next and last slide, please. Once we refrain from so confusing matters, very interesting questions continue to need answers. So we won't run out of work. We may ask, for instance, why Carnap remembered the Aufbau he did and not the one that Michael Friedman and Rick Creath have deciphered for us. We may also ask, for instance, why he insisted on reading Tractatus as he did. It may very well be, in that respect, that what remained salient for Carnap was what many circle colleagues thought about it, especially if we add that he thought so too around 1930. So that would be one set of questions. Another one would be to ask whether and why Carnap himself decided already early on, and now perhaps without any confusion at all, whether he decided to smooth out the multiple rough edges of this period from in the late 20s and 1930, to smooth out these rough edges for the autobiography, given that telling the full story would enormously complicate the narrative and, tire out the reader. And incidentally, the unedited long version of the autobiography does not tell us any more about these either. Now, I think there's much to be said for asking either of these questions, but here I must leave them for another of the free afternoons which we scholars often dream about. Hopefully my efforts here haven't put you off asking them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this very interesting talk. So now we have 5 minutes break, and then we come back with a Q&A. Okay, so see you in 5 minutes.
Okay. Hi, Rick.
There, at long last, I can speak.
Ah, good. Thank you. Now I hear you. Yeah. Okay. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. I will send you an email very shortly. The unthinkable has happened, and I will explain in the email.
Okay, I look forward to that. I owe you another one too, because I've had to do yet another revision of that manuscript.
I have to be ready to send you, but that's this. The unthinkable has happened about this webinar here. So I will send that after I listen to the discussion.
Okay, thank you. We'll look forward to that.
Okay.
Oh.
So, well, welcome again. So I think we can start. We can start so the Q&A, and please, I ask you to raise your virtual hands if you want to ask a question. So maybe Carl Robinson. Okay, so I have a question too, but please,
Hello.
Carol, go ahead.
Hello. Gosh, it's a bit intimidating, but here we go. Ms. Uebel, thanks so much for that talk. It was very interesting. I want to speak to you about, or ask you about, the instability of verificationism in Aufbau, which I agree with. And I just wanted to put to you what I think the reason is for it, and to just hear your opinion about that. So, I think that verificationism, whether it's construed as strict or liberal, or using your distinctions, v-crit or v-tom, any version of that, is inconsistent with the idea that constructions stand in a deductively relationship with each other. I think the combination of any kind of criterion for meaning which relies on synthetic or empirical information that then asks for definitions to stand deductively in a deductive relationship with each other seems to me there seems to be a tension there, conceptual tension, which nearly is directly opposed to the analytic synthetic distinction, which is so distinctive of the positivist of the positive movement and their whole campaign. So it's a surprising partnership, and it also seems to be in tension with the idea that that inference is tautological. I don't know if any of that makes sense to you.
I'm sorry?
I don't know if that tension of verificationism with
I see. That's the end of
in the
it.
construction system.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Now, to tell you the truth, I don't quite understand why verificationism should be inconsistent with any deductive relationship between between theories and things that might be evidence for it. But what I certainly do agree with is that this idea that all inference is tautological. Well, that certainly stands, as I understand, certainly stands in sharp contrast and inconsistent with what we know about inductive reasoning, and that that expands our stock of knowledge, and is not conservative, and is precisely it's precisely, so to speak, the this gulf that Carnap tried to bridge there in 1930, and actually already it seems in Neue Grundlegung, although that's even unclear there, in that Warsaw lecture of 1930, that gulf does not seem between deduction and induction does not seem to be, to me, to be bridgeable. So on that point, I certainly agree with you.
Okay, I want to press you a little bit on the verificationist thing, even though obviously I put my hands up to your view. If concepts are supposed to gain meaning through a verificationist, which is at base an empiricist principle that relies on experience for concepts to gain meaning, for them to have content, and does that not stand in tension with Hume's fork and the idea that inferences, that especially demonstrative reasoning, deductive inferences, are empty and trivial? Concepts are meant to be analytic if they're in a deductive relationship, and it doesn't seem to me like you can have concepts like those in a construction system like Aufbau.
Yeah, but concepts, I mean, you can, I mean, even if you're a concept empiricist, that means that somehow the concepts are grounded in, however one wants to understand it, in experience. But then nevertheless our knowledge is formulated in forms of statements, and those statements, once you have, you can form universally quantified statements, and they certainly go beyond what can be strictly verified. So if that is what you mean, yes, I totally agree.
And do you not think that could be responsible partly for the instability that
well, no,
that
the instability, the instability that I meant to talk about was simply that the Aufbau in different parts makes different assertions as to how to deal with universally quantified statements. In paragraph 180, he more or less he actually affirms strict verificationism. Now, if he affirms strict verificationism, then there can't be a role for universally quantified statements. So paragraph 180 then affirms the very molecularism that all his retrospective accounts tell us the Aufbau was about. And yet in other parts of the Aufbau, for instance, paragraph 97, he sort of happily allows universal quantification without talking either about any restrictions or anything else. So it's that instability that
you're referring to.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So next question. I have one question, Thomas. So I'm wondering whether Carnap's migration to the United States influenced the way his philosophy from the 20s has been remembered by himself, or even the way he himself chose to recount and frame it later in life. I'm curious about how the principle of verificationism, which played such a central role in his early work, or it is supposed so, was subsequently interpreted, reshaped in light of a different environment in which Carnap worked after the war. So, I'll ask you to say something about
Oh, I see.
this,
Well,
and what you
that's
think, because I heard about some theses that see in the migration one of the reasons Carnap was confused about his early work or his early thought.
I see. Right. Well, that's an interesting question, and it's interesting. It's interesting. It's interesting in the light of some of the work that Sander Verheij has been doing, who sort of looked at the American reception of logical empiricism, or the Vienna Circle, and found that several exponents of it were quite happy to, for instance, Feigl and Blumberg in their manifesto. I always think of it as a counter manifesto to the other one. by God, they actually run a straight line from Carnap to from Wittgenstein to Carnap, and in fact, interestingly enough, in that very paper, themselves affirm something like every statement can be reduced back to the given. But I only discovered it recently rereading it. Normally one reads over that and kind of says, yeah, it has to be reinterpreted. But no, actually there it is. So in that sense, yeah, but that was way back in the, when Carnap came to the US, that was the late 30s, perhaps the reduction, perhaps attempts to read the Vienna Circle or logical empiricist in a reductionist way were maybe quite frequent. But given that the autobiography was written in the 1950s, mid 1950s. It's an interesting suggestion, but I'm not I'm not immediately convinced by it, because it's I mean, especially since his own work ever since 36 was very much against reductive attempts, trying to reduce theoretical terms to observation terms, etc., all that kind of stuff. He was against that. Now, that, of course, you could say that could still be consistent with him remembering his own earlier self in that other foundationalist sort of framework, but I don't know. These are these. So I mean, we've already got the Tagebücher by the diaries by Carnap, which I don't think quite tell us either way on this question. So I'm wondering whether there are any documents could conceivably sort of decide this. But the suggestion is an interesting one. But I can't really see the. I can't really see that possibility more likely than that he simply remembered, for some reason or other, how everybody was thinking of the Aufbau around 1930 in the Vienna Circle. So he kind of that rather than how they were received in America, because when he himself was in America, he did not push any reductionist line anymore. But thank you for the suggestion. It's very interesting.
Fair enough. Thank you. So this question is by Gabriel Neves. Please, Gabriel.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentation and also for the hosts. I apologize from the outset if this question is about one of the topics you said was better left for another item, but asking it anyway. I was wondering if you have any comments on whether, and if so, how, the difference between the meaning we currently more commonly attribute to the notion of the given and that which Carnap attributed certainly in the earlier years of his career, where the given has, let's say, less of a foundationalist or a pure foundationalist uh, connotation, seeing as he often attributes the the given as a common point between both positivists and neo-Kantians. So, to sum up, if this apparently difference between our conceptions of the given could help us understand our own difficulties in making sense of how Carnap retells this story of his development. I'm not sure if the question was sufficiently clear. I apologize.
The question is a very interesting one, but I must ask you to explain a little bit more how you distinguish the two kinds of understanding the given. One I understand, namely this phenomenalist kind of what it's like kind of stuff. But you were pointing to something which you said might be even earlier in Carnap. So there I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Again, I will not pretend to have a deeper knowledge than anyone else here. It's certainly not so about the earlier Carnap. But if I'm not mistaken, in the text, for example, which were collected in the first volume of the collected works, you often find Carnap referring to these common acceptance by both the positivist school and the neo-Kantian schools that knowledge must be understood as being built up from something like an empirical basis. This seems to treat, and this seems to be the notion of the given that he's working with, not a strictly phenomenalist one that perhaps we more commonly associate now with it.
Right now, there I must admit perhaps my ignorance, but I would tend to read what Carnap says about the given there as what everybody agrees, precisely in that phenomenalist way. I don't see. I wouldn't draw a distinction between those two types of given, because what one thing Carnap does throughout this period, and only stops if he ever stops. Well, he sometimes seems to be backsliding a little bit, but later on he doesn't do so much. But he's certainly in the 20s and early 30s. He sort of says that our knowledge is based on something like the given, is something that everybody agrees with. He more or less sort of claims so, and so that has, of course, Neurath sticking out like a very sore thumb. But that's life. So yeah. So, but thank you for the question.
Thank you.
So next question is Katerina, next in line. Please, Katerina.
We can't hear you.
Katerina? Please, we don't hear you.
Now you hear me.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry. I had this control and I always forget that I put it. Okay, sorry. So the question is this, and before ask you the question, let me make a premise. I'm now working on the distinction between rational reconstruction and explication, according to whether they are different or not different kind of conceptual constructions. And here, Carnap scholars sort of divided into two blocks, so to say. Someone says that there is a continuity between rational reconstruction and explication, and some others say that there is a discontinuity between rational reconstruction and explication. Among the supporters of the discontinuity thesis, there is, I think, Michael Friedman in the paper from 2012. And he stresses the discontinuity according to the Carnap's agenda for philosophical deflationism. So the point for Friedman is in Aufbau, Carnap was coping with the metaphysics of idealism and realism in the theory of knowledge, while in with explication the anti-metaphysical program changed, and the deflationary program is related to those existential questions that then have been passed on to the agenda of the neo-Carnapians nowadays, okay, whether numbers exist, etc. Obviously, between empiricism, semantics, and ontology and Carnap's writing of the autobiography, there are several years. And this is something that Christian Dambok initially gave a great talk about. But my question is this: can we consider maybe Carnap's way of considering the Aufbau in the autobiography as a new deflationary answer to a changing metaphysical environment in his philosophical co-workers or philosophical environment? So I want to push you to sort of try to consider this reading of the Aufbau as a new deflationary answer to a changing metaphysical environment, so to a changing agenda in anti-metaphysics. Thanks.
Well, my problem here is I must ask you what do you see as particularly deflationary in the way Carnap described the Aufbau in the autobiography? But maybe I've misunderstood your
No, you understood very well. You understood very well. It is a sort of rather, I mean, Carnap's way of remembering the Aufbau is rather anti-deflationist, I would say, because of the foundationalism, etc. But maybe, verificationism and the way he remembers it, I just want to raise the problem that could we consider this as a new answer to a changing metaphysical environment? Yeah.
Not really. Not really. I think it's in the. I mean, in a very roundabout way, maybe. I mean, now we come to one of those questions for the another free afternoon. So let's pinch a bit of future time here. Let's suppose, because one of the questions, was he really confused, and why does he say this, and blah blah blah. If one were to take seriously or hypothetically sort of and entertain the notion that Carnap knew exactly what he was doing in the Aufbau. So he knew that the story he told wasn't it wasn't the truth, nothing but the truth, and blah blah blah. So it wasn't a total story. He gave it a much smoothed kind of narrative, right? And he gave it, in fact, a narrative because, crikey, if he were to try to explain what Untersuchungen did, what he tried to do Untersuchungen, what failed in the Untersuchung, what he tried in the this hapless project with his tautological nature of inference and that kind of, well, maybe he would lose half the readers of the autobiography at that time, and it would certainly draw the reader's attention to, well, something which he may think ultimately, look, those were Jugendsünden, yeah, you know, misdemeanors of his relative youth, so to speak, philosophical youth. They don't really have any bearing on the kind of philosophical message that he still wanted to bring across. And that was precisely the deflationism of the 1950s and that kind of stuff, which he deals with later on in the autobiography. So now, if he did that, if he sort of says, no, it's not a, in fact, one could see this not only as a move to avoid embarrassment about youthful indiscretion, philosophical indiscretion, so to speak, but perhaps also to sharpen, and that would now sort of riff on your question, to sharpen the account of his own philosophical development as from, you know, in the depth of philosophy, quite traditional epistemology and kind of stuff, and working his way out of that to reach the deflationist sort of position 30 years later, which in a way makes it I mean, I think it's just as impressive to see him already trying out various things in the late 20s and 30s and see whether it flies or not. But that's a complex matter. You know, the narrative is, and it certainly goes from, you know, an old, nearly old-fashioned philosopher, by no means fully, but in certain respect, to the deflationist. And maybe that, and that would be that. In that case, the decision to write the autobiography in that kind of streamlined way could perhaps be understood as Carnap responding to the new philosophical situation he found in America. Maybe that way.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So it's now turn of Luca.
Okay, so Thomas, thank you for this talk. That was great. So I learned a lot. I have a question that is mostly maybe an incomprehension on my side of Carnap's Aufbau. So when you talk about the given, so you said that you know, after all, the verificationism is almost all about somehow building from the given. So as you know, so Sellars distinguishes two kinds of given. So it's not only the sensory given, it's also the epistemic given. The way in which neo-Kantians, people like Rickert, understands the given is in both ways. So whereas for Kant, the given is simply the sensory given, so the sensation, which somehow has a correspondence to a particular individuality, and the collection of these individualities or particulars starts the cognitive process for Kant. Now, in the Aufbau, so it seems to me that Carnap is driven by a very strict principle of verification, because once again, he starts, the basic unit of the conceptual constructions are Erlebnissen, which are the sensory given. But then in the same, you know, in the same work, in the Aufbau, there is also this sort of neo-Kantian room for objects such as values. And I don't understand very well how Carnap can justify things like values by adopting a notion of the given, which is a sensory notion, and not like also neo-Kantians do, an epistemic notion. So maybe it's me who doesn't understand this tension between these two kinds of the given. But so what are your thoughts about that?
That's a difficult question. Now, it's certainly true that this talk of values of in Aufbau by Carnap is something he didn't continue later on.
Right.
He sort of dropped. So in some sense, I mean, some people, Thomas Moorman, I believe, have sort of pointed to the possible influence of Rickert in there, but there's certainly these seem to be echoes, at least, of something maybe Kantian. But then the question arises whether the whether what Carnap manages to constitute there as values would really be quite values in the sense or in the way in which the Kantians or neo-Kantians would like to understand them, namely as something possessing kind of objectivity. Because if I remember right, Carnap wants to construct values out of value experiences, and that brings us very much pretty closely back to sort of sensory experience of pleasure, displeasure, etc., kind of thing. Now, I may have got him wrong, but
there is also, if I may, there is also this claim in if I don't go wrong, in 151, in which actually the language Carnap uses for values is pretty much Rickert and Windenball. So values are objects that exist independently of us. So it's very. So I'm questioning the consistency.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you that that Carnap. I don't think Carnap could. Well, he certainly hasn't. As far as I remember, these are not, between you and me, my favorite parts of the Aufbau. So, but as I remember, I don't think he manages to make the case that that what he constitutes as values is something objective. Because I mean, what he would have to do is, what he would have to do is go through a process of intersubjectivization for them, which he does, for instance, for physical objects and stuff.
Yeah.
And there is nothing of that sort. There's some hand waving towards some other theorist whose name I just said, towards Driesch, but again, nothing concrete there. So I don't think that works in the Aufbau.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's now time for Richard. Richard, great. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I want to pick up on this notion of the given, and I don't think I want to disagree with anything you've said, but there is at least the possibility of another notion of the given that would come out more naturally out of thinking about logical construction. And in particular, out of sort of Russell's logical construction of mathematics, or of arithmetic, if you prefer, out of sets, in his case, and in Frege's case, construction of the number 2 out of sets of pairs. And the point I would want to make is that in this context, the notion of phenomenal given doesn't make much sense. But a different sort of notion of given does make sense, namely the materials out of which one makes the construction. Let me give a better example, perhaps, than the various kinds of constructions of the number 2 that could be given on different bases. Whitehead, in the unpublished and since destroyed volume 4 of Principia, wanted to construct points out of intervals and regions, in which case the given would be those intervals and regions, and what gets constructed out of them would be the points. In our more normal geometry, we start with points and construct one-dimensional arrays of them and two-dimensional arrays of them and three-dimensional arrays of them. And the given in that case are the points. So there is a sense in logical construction of a given, which is simply the starting points that one has. So the suggested but not carried out logical construction of the world on a physical basis, the given would be the physical basis on that one starts with. Now, it might be easy, and I'm not trying to disagree with what you said. I think it's very interesting, but there is at least the possibility that what is the given in his preferred construction or the started construction in the Aufbau may be phenomenal, but in construing it as the given for a logical construction, which is what it is, there need not be a commitment to certainty about it. There might not even be a commitment to certainty about the set theory with which one can construct the numbers on the basis of set theory without having any commitment about the degree of confidence we should have in the set theory. And this idea that it must be phenomenal and that it must be certain and it must be foundational is something that may have been foisted on us by C.I. Lewis and Wilfrid Sellars. And there's just enough of that in the actual Aufbau to make this a natural way to look at it, and a natural way for him to run those two notions of the given together in a way that didn't have to be there in the Aufbau, and he might not simply have been distinguishing between them. I'm not saying that this notion of the given is the right one and the other one is the wrong one. My guess is that we just haven't explored the idea of the given as starting point in logical construction enough. Let me rephrase that. I haven't investigated it enough, and it strikes me as that is an interesting thing to explore in the process of trying to figure out what is happening, because I really do want to take Principia as a kind of role model for the Aufbau, and insofar as we do that, the notion of a phenomenal given doesn't make much sense there. Is this an avenue worth exploring? I'm not asking you to say that it's right, because I don't.
No, I would very much think so, because the way I've heard what you just sort of proposed, where I understand that to be a sort of a variation on establishing that the Aufbau itself is kind of anti-foundationalist, as you pointed out, that because the way you have described now, let's speak the given as starting point for logical construction alone as you put it, there's no commitment. There need be no commitment to the certainty of it, and that is, of course, precisely what you and Michael and stuff have always sort of pointed out, and Alan and everybody who's sort of shown that the Quinian reading of the Aufbau is not, at a minimum, not the whole story, if not mistaken. That precisely those sort of foundationalist commitments are, for the largest part, absent in the book. Right. So in that sense, I would indeed agree with you, and that's yet on the other hand, in the just to bring it back to the autobiography, there, however, Carnap explicitly speaks about the given in those sort of terms, in those terms of certainty and that kind of stuff. And that is what perhaps is, you know, I mean, that was a sense of the given in which you know, I've treated it mostly here, because to sort of see precisely what may have prompted him to do that, rather than think only of, or rather than think of the more non-committed given that he did use in much of the Aufbau. So I think it'd be a very interesting way of exploring the given through the book in various ways. Yes, thank you.
So it's time for Mac.
Yeah, my name is David McElhose. I'm using my personal Gmail, which my friends call me DMac, so that's why it says DMac. But my name is David McElhose. I just wanted to get clear on what you guys are puzzled about, and why you're puzzled about that. So what struck me from that quote that you pulled from the autobiography, I wasn't as concerned with the commitment to strict verificationism as the pointing out the end goal as being some kind of certainty as the hallmark of epistemology. So I mean, you spent a lot of time about this self-attribution of strict verificationism, how Carnap always knew that universal quantification was going to fail by the strict verificationist standard. But when you pull that passage from the autobiography, which isolates this, I don't get the impression that he's talking about himself and his commitments, but rather that he's talking about the original positivist pipe dream that he's wrestling with in the Aufbau. I mean, he's talking about certainty. He mentioned certainty as the pinnacle, the thing that you get when you construct knowledge from this phenomenalist foundation. And that doesn't sound like a Carnapian commitment to me at all, not in the early days or the later days. He seems to think that scientific claims are corrigible. And so he's a fallibilist about epistemology, and he seems more focused on method in these works. So in that case, if we read that passage in particular, it's not really talking about his commitments, but talking about the pipe dream that he's that he's wrestling with here. Why is there a puzzle? What is the puzzle of?
Well, because the puzzle is precisely that he literally and explicitly ascribes this pipe dream to. He uses the first person plural to us, to himself and his friends in the Vienna circle.
That's right.
That's the puzzle. I mean, you know, why would he want to ascribe that to himself when in fact there's good reason to think that already in the early days he wasn't committed to that.
Well,
so that's precisely the puzzle.
Well, the commitment was to work with this as this is the starting point. This is what we're struggling with. They recognize that there's problems in it, and there's no real one positivist doctrine when he's saying that us. There is a view that they all share, right? They're arguing about this. They're meeting every Friday afternoon, trying to
well, they don't argue. They didn't argue about that. I mean, as far as I can see, Schlick never wavered much with his in his commitment to. More or less, I mean, it's not Schlick's foundationalism is a quasi, is also a very strange one, but he certainly stuck with it, and but that was, you know, in these early days. I mean, they do this foundationalism is there. I mean, as I have read Feigl and Blumberg, this paper, what is it? Logical Positivism, a new movement on the horizon, or something like that, in Journal of Philosophy, 1931, which really presented the Vienna Circle to the North American audience, and there that very story, which we now here sort of say, why did Carnap feed this monster? Right there, this story, it's actually put forward as saying this is what we believe.
So what's
And
really
so the puzzle that is exercised, not just me but other people as well. I mean, I referred to this paper by Michael Friedman and earlier work by Richard Creath and stuff. Why if Carnap, as we have good reason to believe, if he wasn't into that, why does he then turn around 20 years later and describe his own early work in those terms? What's going on?
It seemed to me that he was just stating the pipe dream, and then that's the starting point.
Have another look at the text. He says more than that. He identifies himself pretty closely with it. I mean, I admit he didn't. He says this is our. I don't have it right now. I mean, he's
it's manifesto.
He does identify himself very strongly with it.
Well, that's my question. Like the more precise way to put the question is, why are you so focused on what he's saying about quantification within the backdrop of strict verification, rather than this claim about certainty? Well, that's what really startled me from the passage. Like certainty, like they.
Well, it's because
that's a Cartesian goal.
I can tell you why I focused upon that. I don't know whether other people have to do that. Well, I focused upon that because that I use it as a focal point to see whether he's committed to strict verificationism or not.
I see. Okay, so yeah, it's just a focal point. But you do acknowledge that there's other mysteries within this passage.
Look, our Carnap, he's got more mysteries for us than we can sort out in one afternoon.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. So the next question is by
Silvano. There was a question from Ofra Rector.
Yeah, it was, but I don't see Ofra. So I invite Nata Young to introduce this question.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I was just wondering the puzzle. Do you have have you considered the possibility about the cultural discussion? Say he was in Germany, in Vienna, in Europe, and the culture there are more or less more similar to the culture difference in between Europe and the States. And would that be a possibility that he readdress this topic and maybe change the view? That is also maybe related to the universal quantifier, in the sense that what is taken as an object of discussion in different cultures.
I think in principle this is a very worthwhile question. But in this particular instance, in this particular case, I mean, with regard to what the universal quantifier does or not, I don't see much of a difference between how that was understood in Vienna or in the United States at the time. I mean, we're not Carnap was, as I understand him, in those passages we're discussing, he was addressing standard logic and standard understanding of sentences. He wasn't addressing what once upon a time was called deviant logic or alternative logics, other kind of stuff. So it was a standard. And the question whether the culture in the United States may have prompted him to revisit questions he asked 30, 40 years ago and now rethought how he did so. I think we've touched on that in an earlier question, and I can't really see any support for that right away. Which is not to say there might not be any, but I can't think of any.
Okay, thank you.
So just we'll check about Offer's questions. Offer,
Yeah, I can just make up there like a 1 minute comment, and then I was trying to go back to the Carnap-Hilbert connection, but maybe just a follow up on Richard's comment. So there may be a very simple continuity between some sort of givenness and between the logical and the phenomenological givenness, because, well, I don't know how what is the German for certainty that he uses?
Sicherheit, Gewissheit, I would say.
Evidence, ever?
Evidence, yes. Evidence. Well, nowadays you would say evidence is evidence, and then that leaves it open. But of course, if you go back to Brentano, evidence will have Gewissheit.
Right. But it doesn't have to. So the whole thing doesn't have to be veridical. Just being given something. It's certainly that way in Hilbert and Bernays. Being what you get is the logical consequences. The consequences for logic have to do with the verifiability, right? But not with, there's no immediate apprehension of truth or anything. The certainty is not a given in that sense. Am I being unclear?
No. I see what you mean, and I think with regard to, I'm not so sure about the continuity between this logical given and the phenomenal given, since the phenomenal given seems to live precisely of the immediacy. This I cannot doubt that something is happening, but whatever it is, I don't know what it is, but something is happening. That kind of stuff. And whereas the logical isn't, and sorry, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted there's a Luca was there is a Kantian, through the thinking of the Hilbertian and the Kantian tradition, there will be a kind of immediacy that is object related, and whether or not and how it's related to commitments to truth or is an important question, and it's not one that is left to just fall out of what is.
Yeah. With regard to Hilbert, I was just thinking of his typical understanding of his program. The sort of he did think of having a core of things he can establish by finite steps. So for whatever the logical given for Hilbert's arithmetic seems to be quite. He had certain epistemological ambitions for that. So which is it wasn't altogether all the same whether it was true or not. But
Right. But but that didn't have to be. There are a few ways of cutting this cake and moving the lines. But which I thought. Thank you for your talk. There's a lot in that area, what you said that is important to think about. I mean,
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
So there is time for a last question. Noah, please. There is another question, Jerry. Okay, you did. So Noah, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the talk, Thomas. Here's a story that I think that helps your case. So in the years between 1928 and 1931, in the discussions in the circle, they develop a kind of misreading of the Aufbau that overemphasizes certain aspects and underemphasizes others, and the they in that sentence includes Carnap himself. At that moment, Feigl emigrates to the United States, and he takes this kind of foundationalist misreading with him, and so he writes the paper with Bloomberg that introduces logical positivism to the American world. Some years later, Carnap emigrates to the United States and discovers that this misunderstanding, but he kind of doesn't care about this anymore because his concerns have moved on and he's not working on the same issues. So he doesn't bother to correct it to the extent that he even notices it. And then that's the version that gets picked up in the autobiography when he writes about it. So I take that story to be quite amenable to the sort of case you've been making in your talk. But here's the part that I think is puzzling, is that elsewhere in the autobiography, earlier on, he says, this is not a direct quotation, but something to the effect of, as I was preparing to write this, I went back and reread the Aufbau. And I thought it was pretty good. I found a lot of really interesting, fresh ideas in there. And I enjoyed rereading this. So he's just reread the book. And then the thing that he produces is the 1930 misunderstanding, not the 1926 sort of correct understanding. And isn't that puzzling?
That would be even more puzzling than I think we should be already. But unless I'm mistaken, I've just misread. I've just reread the book. Is in fact, he said, is in fact in the preface to the second edition of Aufbau. We'll have to check. I mean, my memory is not what it used to be. But I think actually that statement is not in the autobiography, but it's in the preface to the second edition. And now the preface to the second edition first came out in German, I think in 1961. So that was 3 years before the autobiography came out, obviously in English, in 1963. But from all we know, he was working on the autobiography in the mid-50s, sort of 56, 57, 57, maybe 58 or something. Whereas I'm not sure, we'll have to go back to the diaries, which even on the net, I believe, we certainly are there to sort of precisely when he did that. But when he wrote the introduction to the second edition. But I would have thought those are two separate things. Maybe then he thought, oh my goodness, but for certain reason, there's lot whatever. So it would be extremely puzzling, but yeah. But
good.
that's
Okay, so
where I would get him out of it.
So maybe I've also quite misremembered exactly where that.
I mean, you could perhaps push the question in saying, well, if he found out and it wasn't that bad, etc., and he realized, why didn't he go back and sort of rewrite the passage for the autobiography? But that's. I understand the Schilp volume itself has a rather complicated story, and it lay with the editor for several years, and he may have had good reason to say that even if in 1960 when he reread it and thought, oh my goodness, I told him a a bunch of story. It isn't quite true. Blah blah blah. He might have said, "Look, I'll have to let it ride because it's just too much bother trying to start another war with Schilp or something." Anyway, but thanks for your question.
Time for the very last question. Jerry, please.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and the illumination of many ideas here that I'm not familiar with or was not familiar with. By training, I'm a biochemist and not a philosopher nor a scientist or a mathematician in that context. But I have a longstanding interest in the relationship between the Aufbau and emergence and evolution and those sorts of issues that are quite relevant to the text from a modern perspective. And so here I'd like to follow up on Richard's question with regard to Whitehead and Whitehead's notion of atomicity. And if you read Process and Reality, as I've been doing recently, one is struck by the continual coherence of Process and Reality with modern chemistry, with modern biology, et cetera, where the language of categories, etc., from Whitehead are quite explicitly open to atomicity and hence to strong verification and to one-to-one correspondence relationships between atomic sentences and molecular sentences. So I was struck by the interpretation you gave to molecular sentences and the whole mindset that seems to be a different perspective of atomicity and molecularity between the two authors. And so do you have particular notions or views about how Carnap addressed these issues in the 1950s as opposed to the relative primitive state of chemistry in the 1920s?
No, I'm afraid I'll have to draw a blank on that. He did write a what did he write? He did where is it? Oh, he did write, sorry about this, but he did write this thing called 2 Essays on Entropy, and I suspect maybe that's where you could find an answer to this, but I wouldn't wish to incriminate myself by giving a wrong answer to this.
Two essays on entropy.
2 Essays on Entropy by Carnap. Yeah, that
Okay.
It was edited with an introduction by Abner Shimony, came out in 1977. So that's a posthumous.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I would thanks again Thomas for his very illuminating, interesting talk, for his generous replies to the question. I will thank all of you for participating, and Luca and Katerina for organizing this meeting. Before saying you goodbye, I would remember that the next meeting is scheduled for June 11. Alan Richardson will be the speaker of this meeting. So thank you again and goodbye.
Thank you,
Next
everybody.
time.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Thomas.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye.
Richard.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Hi, Zach.
Bye.
Oh, thank you so
Bye.
much. And Thomas, if I may say something, congratulations, because today we reached the all-time high attendance with 53. So it's remarkable. It's the end of the semester, and we got 53 people connected for this seminar.
Well, it was a title where you could expect all sorts of. Well, anyway,
Yeah.
I'm very happy that worked out that way. Cheers.
Yeah. Don't deflect the compliment. So.
Pleasure.
Yes, congratulations.
Cheers.